everything we need. I don't know about you, but sometimes I need to hear that. I'm visual when I think about things, but sometimes I just need to hear it. You know, times get rough, going gets tough. Sometimes you just need to hear it. God has everything we need. Good morning, David Chapel. It's another blessed day, another day's journey, and I'm glad about it. To my pastor, the Reverend Dr. Joseph C. Parker Jr., in his absence, we would like to say thank you for giving me this opportunity to stand in your stead. As I always say, I take this responsibility seriously, but I do thank him for the opportunity. Ain't a whole lot of preachers in Austin allowing folks to step in their pulpit, and so I thank him for allowing me to be here today. I want to thank Reverend Tapscott for reading the scripture today. He was doing double duty. You hear that melodious bass back there? Everything we need. So thank you for reading the scripture. In your spare time when you're going throughout your week, I'd recommend reading that entire chapter, Numbers 22. It'll give you some insight and some background in what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm not going to keep you that long since the clock has already started. But the title of this sermon is Lessons Learned from a Donkey and a Jackass. Now, I work in a project office, and one of the things project teams do after a project is something called lessons learned. The members of the team gather, take turns describing what went well, what didn't go well, and during that project. And during this process, everyone has an equal voice on what they feel the lessons learned are. We actually go around the room and everyone discusses what the good lessons were as well as the bad lessons. We then document what was learned and archive the information for use in other projects. The hope is that what is learned can be applied to another project to help it run smoother. Well, I believe life should be lived the same way. We're all participating in a project, a race. We're all called to run it, and we all learn while we're doing it. God has called us to do something. And it makes sense because we all believe God has everything we need. Yeah, everything we need for us to work in our area of giftedness. We all have a calling. We all have a project or race we need to manage. So, if we're going to successfully implement the calling God has on our lives, we need to recognize the requirements, resources, and yes, we need to periodically do lessons learned to make sure we're on the right track. We can then apply what we learn while we're participating in a race. And if we do it right, others can see our lessons learned or example to help them run their race. For many of us, the desire to manage our race is difficult. It's difficult because we refuse to apply the lessons we learn along the way. And as a result, we find ourselves continuing to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And these mistakes keep us from achieving the purpose God has for us. Now, don't get me wrong. I know we all make mistakes. But it is those of us that learn from them that truly move forward in our calling. Author Dale E. Turner says it best when he states, some of the best lessons we ever learn are learned from past mistakes. The error of the past is the wisdom and success of the future. I believe that if you aren't learning from your mistakes, you're just spinning your wheels, and no amount of grace will move you along the path God has for you. Another scholar, Denzel Washington, says it a little differently. He believes strongly that we should fail forward. And as an older man, I now understand what that means. Failing forward means you learn from the mistakes you made, correct them, and move forward rather than failing backward. See, failing backward wastes time and energy. Another one of the mistakes we make is we allow worldly motives to impact our spiritual walk. Yeah, what we want to do versus what God wants us to do or what he wants for us. And sometimes it's just difficult to remember that to successfully run our race, we must do as Romans 12:2 tells us. We're called to be imitators of, not to be imitators of the world, not to do things or act as those in the world, but transform our minds in order that we know what's good and pleasing and perfect to God. If we're not careful, we'll find ourselves acting and doing things just like the world does. Our motives will become our own rather than God's. And see, that's the issue in our text today. We see a man called Balaam. Balaam was a Gentile prophet during the period when the Israelites have come out of Egypt and prior to them entering the promised land. And as for the Israelites' move, they were conquering those who opposed them. And Balaam, he appeared to know God and was known for his power to bless or curse nations. And as a matter of fact, he's what you would call a prophet for hire. Balaam is summoned by Balak, the king of the Moabites. Balak is concerned that the Israelites will destroy his nation, and so he calls for Balaam to put a curse on them so that Balak may destroy them and drive them away. And when the first envoys come to Balaam and present their requests, Balaam seeks God, and God tells him not to go with them because the Israelites are a blessed people. Now, Balaam was a man who knew how to listen to the voice of God. Yet his greed became his downfall, and he became disobedient. He found himself doing God's will, but with the wrong motivations. And as we attempt to follow God and fulfill his purpose for our lives, I believe we can find some lessons learned by observing Balaam's example. But I also believe there's some lessons learned by also observing the behavior of his donkey. So you see, the first lesson we learn is we have to know and do the will of God. So Balaam was about to go on a journey for the wrong reasons. He was wrong because while he knew God in his head, he didn't know God in his heart. He also let his lust for money and prestige keep him from making good choices. If we look back in the text, we see that Balak sends a delegation to ask Balaam to curse Israel. Balaam knew about Israel. He also knew about the covenant Israel had with God. Remember, God made a covenant with Abraham when he said in Genesis 12:1-3, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will make. I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Unfortunately, Balaam had an inadequate understanding of who God was. He also was not aware of the sovereignty of God. The pagan gods were far from sovereign. We know, of course, that they did not even exist. But these gods were thought to be open to manipulation by means of persistence, repetition, and other extreme measures. But Balaam made the mistake of placing God on the same level of all the other gods he followed. We know this because Balaam initially told the delegation that God said no. But notice he next tells them, "Y'all stay the night so we can see what more God will say." I believe all Balaam was trying to do was get God to do his will rather than the other way around. Perhaps he could have settled the matter, but he also left out one crucial piece of information. God told Balaam to not go with the delegation from Balak and not put a curse on the people because they are blessed. The only thing Balaam said was, "Y'all go on back to your land because God has refused to let me go with you." Leaving out the information about Israel being blessed led to his disobedience. Let's leave Balaam alone for a moment. Because aren't we the same way? Balaam just did what we do sometimes. We do what we can to keep open the possibility that God will change his mind. Don't we try to do this sometimes? We try it as kids. We try it as adults. Parents, have you ever told your kids not to do something only to get that whiny response and then have them come back over and over again with different reasons why you should let them do what they're asking you to do? We do that all the time. Remember when no meant no? We get conflicted between what we believe God's will is for us and what we want to gain. We want what the world has to offer, and we want Jesus. Then we try to coax God to do what we know is not his will for our lives. Like us as parents, God will sometimes allow us to do what he knows isn't good for us, just so we can understand the lesson for ourselves. But we have to be careful as Christians to stay in God's will for our lives and to remember to stay focused by asking God constantly to create in us a clean heart, renew a right spirit within us. So what's the lesson learned? Follow God's command, and whether he says yes or no, stay in his will. Perhaps like Balaam, we might be tempted by the offer of wealth and power. However, what is clear from the beginning that God would not approve of what we are being asked to do. That is the time to determine to do what pleases God. Why delay, as Balaam did, thinking, well, maybe God will change his mind by the next morning? When a similar, even more alluring temptation comes our way and God's response to us is no, wouldn't we be better off to acknowledge that no right away? I believe that sometimes when we have already missed out on God's best by our disobedience, God allows us to do something less than the best that he has for us. And for Balaam, this meant learning a lesson the hard way. Balaam's failure to allow God to follow God's command leads to his next lesson learned. Disobedience leads to distraction. So the interesting thing about this passage is that God chooses to use Balaam's donkey to get his attention. Balaam accompanies the distinguished delegation to meet with Balak. Balaam's donkey suddenly sees the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword. She bolts off the road into a field, but Balaam beat her back onto the road. Now the angel of the Lord stood at a place where the road went between two vineyard walls, narrow. When the donkey saw him standing there, she squirmed past by pressing against the wall, crushing Balaam's feet in the process. So he beat her again. Then the angel of the Lord moved farther down the road and stood in a place so narrow that the donkey couldn't hope to get by. So she lay down in the middle of the road. This enraged Balaam so much he beat her again with his staff 3 times. This donkey saves Balaam's tail. And he can't figure out why she's acting this way because he's distracted and doesn't see what she sees. Then God causes the donkey to speak, asking Balaam, what have I done that deserves you beating me these 3 times? It's incredible. Balaam replies to the donkey. Now, if an animal spoke to one of you, would you respond? Well, perhaps Balaam thought, well, I didn't talk to her enough. She's bound to answer me sometime. This is obviously a miracle. And we know there's only one other place in the Bible where an animal speaks. Remember the garden? Yet Balaam acts as if it happens to him every day. The donkey asks him questions and he answers. In front of this lofty assembly he is traveling with, he holds a conversation with a donkey. Balaam is totally spiritually out of it. He has no thought for God or for spiritual things. He's so self-possessed, so full of self-interest, so distracted that he can't think beyond the end of his face. All he's thinking about is, hey, what am I going to do when I get to Balak? He's going to pile all this money on me. Yeah. How am I going to set up all the sacrifices? What am I going to do? How am I going to say this? I know God will let me do it because I'm just a wonderful negotiator. And that's just the way it is. All the other gods have done exactly as I bargained. Why not this one? And as he travels, he talks to himself like this, thinking only about the wonderful job and wealth he has ahead of him. He's blind to anything else. When a donkey speaks to him, it doesn't even faze him. He don't wonder what's going on. He don't even ask why the donkey was treating him in a way she had never done before. The donkey was totally out of character. She speaks, Balaam answers, like a weird Mr. Ed TV show. See, this illustrates the depth of Balaam's spiritual blindness. He wouldn't have seen the angel of the Lord if he tripped over him. And like Balaam, when we aren't moving in God's will, we get so distracted and discouraged that the miracles in our daily lives seem like everyday occurrences. We allow what we desire to move us off of our mark, keeping us from the race we're called to run. We've got to stay focused and in tune with God's will for our lives. We also can't live on the fence, straddling it like Balaam did. We've got to stand for what God has called us to do. And sometimes that means hearing God and resisting the temptation to do what he wants to do. If God says no, the answer is no. If God says stay away from it, we've got to listen. Stop trying to find the gray area. Sometimes we can interpret our way of God out of God's favor, trying to listen and resist at the same time. We hear God's will but resist because of what we think we want. Stay in the race, stay in your lane, and stay focused on what God is calling you to do. Finally, after getting the wrong example from Balaam, maybe we should just follow the example of the donkey. Not only should we follow God's guidance, but we can be like the donkey and help others do the same thing. Notice the donkey goes out of his way to help Balaam avoid certain death at the hand of the angel. Let me make it personal. I think when you read the Bible, when I read it, we try to put ourselves in the shoes of the people we're reading about. But it's a little bit more difficult to put yourself in the hooves of a donkey. Because it's a donkey, and it's real hard to get into the head of a donkey. But I think in this story, it's so fascinating to me because the donkey is really the example for us. And I think what I need to say right here is, be the donkey. What I mean by that is that sometimes you need someone to be the donkey in your life that keeps you from going where the person knows you shouldn't go. Be the donkey. Be the stubborn donkey in someone else's life. Why does the donkey lay down? That's what's so crazy, because the donkey sees a spiritual reality that Balaam, the great prophet, does not see. Isn't it true that we can be blind to some of the most obvious things in our lives? So much so that we need someone, a dumb donkey or whoever, to get in the way to help us to wake up to reality. Everybody should have a ride or die. Someone that tells us the truth when others don't. See, a friend loves at all times and a brother's born for adversity. But here's the deal. We don't like donkeys that lay down, do we? If you have the courage and you step into the role of prophetic in someone else's life and say, I'm genuinely concerned about where this path is taking you, I promise you this. If they're blinded to the situation they're in, they will probably get just as mad as you as Balaam got with his donkey. But if you hang in there, remember, the donkey saved Balaam's life. Proverbs 27:17 tells us, as iron sharpens iron, so one person should sharpen another. Be the donkey. And I think sometimes we just need to speak love and truth. Write a poem, whatever, have a phone call, but sometimes we just need to bray like a donkey. Sometimes we need to get in the way because you love someone that much. Don't go there. No, you don't want to do this. I love you too much to not get in the way. At the heart of this story is the simple fact that God can use anyone for anything. And if God can use a dumb donkey, he sure enough can use you.